Is there any American abroad more entertaining in his dissection of England than Bill Bryson? I don't think so, which is why we're so happy to have him join us to talk about his new book, The Road to Little Dribbling.
Every country has dipped in and out of fashion, but Britain is really, fundamentally it's the same place it was when I first came to it 40 years ago.
Can we possibly learn to live distraction-free? Our help desk columnist, Molly Young, will be here to talk about several new books that unbelievably seem to suggest we can.
When you talk about productivity, it's a little bit like talking about efficiency, where it really isn't a sort of virtue in itself. It sort of matters very much what you apply it to or what sort of project you're tackling.
Jenny Schuessler will give us an update from the literary world, and Greg Cowles has bestseller news. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Bill Bryson joins us now from Hampshire, England, to talk about his new book, The Road to Little Dribbling, Adventures of an American in Britain. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be with you.
So it's hard to start talking about this book without mentioning another book that you wrote 20 years ago, Notes from a Small Island. When you look back at that book today, how would you describe that first book on England?
Well, the first book, I think, was really kind of a love letter to Britain. At the time I wrote it, we were moving back to America. I grew up in Iowa, so I'm an American. I come from the States. I married an English girl and then lived in England for a long time, at that point about 20 years with my English wife. And in 1995, we got this idea, sort of impetuous idea, to move back to America with our 4 children for a little while. Before I did that, I did a sort of valedictory tour around Britain and wrote a book knowing that I was going to be leaving the country. So the whole idea of that first book was just me looking at this country that had been, my happy home for 20 years and reflecting on how I felt about it then.
So if that was a love letter, this one isn't hate mail, is it?
No, anything but. I mean, some people have accused me of being curmudgeonly, is the word that seems to get used more than any other, but of being grumpy towards Britain now. And I suppose, this is my fault, because that's how I seem to have presented myself to a lot of people. But that's not the way I feel, honestly. I still, I live in Britain again now. I'm very, very happy. I've been back here for a dozen or so years. I'm really, really very happy here. But as with any society, particularly I think anyone that you live in voluntarily, there's a lot of things about it that frustrate me. I mean, one of the things I go on about a lot is this ridiculous austerity that we have to live through in Britain now, that there is this feeling that we in Britain as a society can't afford anything anymore. And so there's sort of just cheese paring all over the place. And I find things like that really exasperating. And that does make me grumpy.
So the royals, they're cutting down on their sort of palace expenses and...
Yeah. Well, when I first came to Britain in the 1970s, it was a time when Britain was really, really on the ropes economically. It was getting loans from the IMF just to keep it afloat. It was in a really bad place. And yet there was plenty of money for things like affordable housing for people. Parks were all well tended and groomed, and there were flower beds in every roundabout on roads. And it was a country that didn't have a lot of money, but it seemed the money it seemed to spend publicly. It seemed to spend very well. And now we're in exactly the opposite position, where the British as a people are wealthier than they've ever been. They really are, pretty well off as a nation. And yet the country behaves as if, there's not a penny to spare for anything. And we're kind of, everything seems to be just getting pruned back harder and harder. And I find that is just one of, among several other things that I find, very exasperated about the country right now.
When you wrote the first book, that was kind of at the height of the Cool Britannia, sort of Tony Blair, just in office mood at the moment.
Right, it was. And nothing has changed except just the way the world regards Britain. Every country has dipped in and out of fashion, or it has its periods where it's considered cool. But Britain is really, fundamentally, it's the same place it was when I first came to it 40 years ago. Much of it hasn't changed. It's just for certain periods the world pays attention to it and thinks, oh yes, that's quite cool. And at other times it sort of drops off the radar, and that seems to be the position it's in at the moment.
But even if it is uncool, you do write about a host of what you call pleasing Britannic things. What are some of those things that have pleased you in your years in England?
Oh gosh, that ought to be a really easy question to answer, but because I'm kind of perpetually immersed in it all, I sometimes forget what it is about it that pleases me so much. There are certain things. I mean, one of the things I talk about is that I think the British are really quite grown up about life. I admire that very much. They're basically sane, in other words. And things that we find in America, where I come from, things that we really struggle to come to terms with, whether just things like patriotism and whether you're going to use stem cells for research, or whether abortions should be universally available, or gun control. All these things that are really very strong, emotive, divisive issues in America. In Britain, people are pretty laid back about it. They're pretty casual about it. People will have two different views, but they don't get incandescent over it. And so that's one of the things I like, is that it's a fairly stable, orderly. I love the history of it, the fact that there's just so much history everywhere. I think it's still, the countryside in particular, is still very, very beautiful. I'm full of admiration for the British that, it's a small island that has been intensively utilized forever, for millennia. It's just lots and lots of people living on a very small landmass and mining it and farming it and building factories and using it very, very intensively. And yet somehow most of it remains incredibly beautiful, which is, something that we can't say about everything in America, where we had lots of space, and yet we seem to have made quite a lot of it fairly unattractive.
You write this book when you're on the cusp of applying for dual citizenship, and I'm curious because you often say, well, when you're saying we, are you thinking of we the Americans, or we the British, or we the Americans abroad?
I don't know. Half the time I don't know. And I mean, in this conversation with you, I'm a little bit of both, because I'm in this odd position with you right now where I'm talking to you as a fellow American, but at the same time I'm standing here in Britain and kind of explaining Britain to American listeners. In this context particularly, I seem to belong to both. Most of the time I don't think about it. I mean, most mornings I wake up, I'm in England, and I don't think, oh gosh, I'm a guy from Iowa who now lives in England. I don't reflect upon it. I don't have any reason to. I just think I'm here because this is where I am now.
You don't worry about the mid-Atlantic accent or anything like that?
Oh, I'd give anything to be able to make my accent work to my own purposes, whatever. But I can't. I'm one of those people who's just hopeless at trying to control my accent. If I try to sound more American, which I really do try to do when I go home to Iowa, I just end up sounding like some sort of, I sound like Deputy Dog, or some terrible travesty of an American accent, as if I'm mocking where I come from.
Bad actor.
Yes, exactly.
You follow in this book something you call the Bryson line. What is the Bryson line? Where does it go to? Where does it end?
Traditionally, people, when they talk about extremities in Britain, the way we say coast to coast in America, they talk about from Land's End to John O'Groats as being the two extremes. When you look on a map, you see that actually it's kind of meaningless, because the only way you can get from Land's End to John O'Groats is way up in northern Scotland. Land's End is down at the very tip of Cornwall. The only way you can get there is by zigzagging your way across the country because of the way Britain is laid out. And I just wondered, what is the longest distance you can travel in Britain in a straight line without actually crossing salt water, without ever touching the sea? And nobody seems to ever have done this before. As far as I could tell, nobody's ever actually undertaken this fairly simple exercise. And it turns out that the line, the kind of axis it defines, goes in the other direction, and it goes from southern central part of England at a little forgotten resort called Bognor Regis, and it goes up to west Scotland to a place called Cape Wrath.
What a great place name that is.
Yeah, it is, Cape Wrath. I mean, as soon as
it's like Cape Disappointment.
I got to go see this place. So I just decided that I called this new line the longest straight line that you can travel in Britain without leaving the country, without going onto the ocean. I called it the Bryson line, jokingly. Although I'd be very pleased if the world started calling it that in commemoration of me. But I called it that, and that would be kind of my guide point. I would start at Bognor Regis and I would finish at Cape Wrath. That was the sort of basic conceit of the book, that I would travel not really along the line because that would have been too limiting, but I would use that as a kind of beacon, that I would use it as my starting and end points.
This is getting me on a tangent trying to think of other sort of terrible Cape names. There's Cape Wrath, there's Cape Disappointment. There's probably some other grim capes in England.
Almost certainly, yeah. The Cape Wrath, as it turns out, is not named because of the violence of the seas or the weather or anything like that. It's actually, apparently it's a corruption of some Viking word that just meant turning point. It's a point where the Viking ships, they were sailing west and then they turned south, or vice versa.
That's a little disappointing, but tell us about Little Dribbling. What's the origin of that name?
The origin of that name is just completely fanciful. I was really stuck for a title of the book, and I was thinking in terms of things like The Road to Dementia or something like that, just describing myself, and they all seemed, unsatisfactory in one way or another, and it just popped into my head that Little Dribbling sounded vaguely descriptive of me at my time of life, but it also sounded just to me just like an actual English place name. There could really be a village called Little Dribbling. I just thought that's what I'll call it, but there isn't. I mean, I should stress there isn't actually Little Dribbling, but there could well be. I mean, it seems completely plausible.
You do return to some places that you visited in the first book. One of them is Stonehenge. And Stonehenge, you write about, has changed a lot in the 20 years for the better.
Yes, it has. Absolutely. I mean, Stonehenge itself has not really changed at all, as you would expect. I mean, the Circle of Stones is the same circle that we saw, when I first came here. But what has changed is the visitor experience. Up until fairly recent times, the Stonehenge Visitor Center was really it looked like a temporary shelter. It looked like something that construction workers would use as their offices when they were on a site. And it really was intended to be only a temporary shelter, but it was a temporary shelter that had been there for like 40 years. Finally, after much arguing and toing and froing and a great deal of indecisiveness, they put together quite a lot of money and several £1 million and built a brand new visitor center out of sight of the stones, which is a really great idea because what it means is the stones are now isolated. For the first time in a long, long time, they stand pretty much isolated away from traffic and extraneous noise and so on. And the visitor center is out of sight. You have to either walk up and over a hill or get on one of these things called a land train that takes you there. And it just means that the experience of going to the stones is so much more moving. And what you see is you see the stones from afar now. I mean, you come up over the crest of the hill and you see the stones in the middle distance in a way that is presumably much as it would have been in prehistoric times. This is what, people who originally went to the stones to worship or whatever it was that drew them there, that's how they would have seen them. And it's really quite powerful. I mean, you realize how strikingly beautiful they are. And they're just the most amazing thing because the amount of effort that had to have gone into putting them together, and the fact that there was nothing like it anywhere on the planet, that this was a completely without precedent. For somebody to have just envisioned them, never mind got them built, was just the most remarkable achievement.
I'm going to pivot to a slightly less well-known British attraction, the Pillbook Study Group.
Yes, I didn't actually encounter them, but I discovered. I don't remember how I discovered it now, but I discovered that there was lots and lots of very strange British societies that are very specialized in particular interests. It's part of the charm of the British is that they really are. They're just like automatically eccentric, but usually in harmless and endearing ways. And one of the ways is that they do form these societies that venerate the everyday things that most people would take for granted or think are not worthy of much attention. One of the other ones I remember is there's a society, name escapes me for the moment, but they go and collect advertisements that are painted on the sides of old buildings. They record them and they take photographs of them, and presumably they meet and share their information and get kind of excited about faded signs on the sides of buildings. There's another one called the Roundabout Appreciation Society, which actually goes out and again takes photographs of or stands around admiring what are perceived to be the most attractive and worthy roundabouts in the country. How they decide one roundabout is better than another, I don't know, but it's something that they obviously take very seriously.
You did go to the Grimsby's Fishing Heritage Center, though.
Yeah, well, Grimsby's a strange and kind of sad place. I hadn't realized this. I mean, it's an old fishing port, old fishing port on the northeast side of the country. It used to be the biggest, busiest fishing port on the planet. I mean, it was bigger than, I knew it was kind of big in British context, but it was bigger than anywhere else in the world. And that was, in fairly recent times. And then the stocks of fish in the North Sea just collapsed, as they have in so many other inshore waters around the world. And Grimsby now has virtually no fishing at all. But what it does have is this rather splendid museum, which is a heritage center. It was just the most charming and interesting, fascinating museum. It's really, really well done. But it's quite dispiriting as well, because it's celebrating something that has gone forever, which is the fishing industry in Grimsby, and needn't have gone at all if people had the foresight to manage the fishing stock sensibly, then people could still be fishing in Grimsby. But instead, what we did as a species and continue to do as a species is just pillage the oceans. And it's really quite disturbing when you see just how extravagant and flagrant we've been with what's in the seas.
Now it has an appropriately Dickensian name.
It is a kind of sadly well-named place.
Is this something that you think you might continue, this kind of 20 years later revisiting? Like perhaps you'll go back to a short history of nearly everything and kind of fill in everything that's happened in terms of scientific advances since you left off?
Oh, I've thought about that. I mean, because a short history of nearly everything. I don't want to discourage anyone from going out and buying it, but I mean, it's been a good few years now, and science, keeps moving on. It really needs updating. And I thought about that, but it would, with a short history of nearly everything, it would be such a big project that I haven't quite found the energy to do it yet. But I would enjoy doing that. The ability to update a book from time to time is an attractive idea.
All right. Well, to be continued then. We'll look for the next sequel. Bill, such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you very much.
That was Bill Bryson, author of The Road to Little Dribbling, Adventures of an American in Britain. Longtime fans of this podcast will be excited to welcome Jenny Schuessler back this week. Jenny, thanks for being here.
Hi, Pamela.
So you are in lieu of Alexander Altar, who has a terrible cold, who wanted to appear but sounded so terrible that our producer refused to let her on. But Jenny is here with a great story this week about Roberto Bolaño.
I recently spent a couple of days in Chicago, where the Goodman Theater is preparing an adaptation of his novel 2666. I first heard about this maybe 9 months ago when they announced it, and I just thought this seemed like a fascinating and crazy undertaking, as I'm sure many of our listeners know because they've read the book. 2666 is this 900-page rather dense, quite challenging, also I would add pretty gripping in its own way, novel that became a huge international sensation after it was published in Spanish in 2006. And it would just seem like the last thing you could ever get to put on stage.
Okay, so for the three listeners who have not read this novel, why would it be so hard to stage?
As Robert Falls, the director of the production in Chicago, said, it takes about 45 minutes to even explain what this novel is about. In addition to just being incredibly long, it's hugely digressive. It takes place over about 100 years. It involves, many, many, many characters. It's written in 5 parts that are very loosely connected, but it sort of centers on this fictional border city in Mexico called Santa Teresa, loosely based on Ciudad Juarez, where, as happened beginning in the 1990s, hundreds of women were just sort of mysteriously turning up, brutally murdered in the desert. In addition to having all this plot, it's just a novel full of all this amazing play of language, jokes, digressions, stories within stories, speculations about literature itself. It's just a sort of magical, indescribable piece of work.
So what is the play like?
Well, that's an interesting question. It's 5 hours long. It's in 5 parts with 2 intermissions, and each part they've really turned it into this big multimedia spectacle. There are elaborate video projections, sort of music and kind of interesting sound design all the way through, 15 actors playing about 80 roles. It seems to me from watching rehearsals like it moves really fast. because there's so much ground to cover. And, each part really has they approach it wanting to give each part a very different feeling, because the book is really kind of 5 separate novellas in a way that are loosely connected. But kind of one of the most amazing things they did is the third part is about an American journalist who travels to Santa Teresa and becomes fascinated by these sort of murders going on in the city, wants to write about them. Surprise, surprise, his editor doesn't want him to. But he also kind of falls in with these lowlifes who kind of seem right out of a Tarantino or Robert Rodriguez movie. And in fact, the directors, Robert Falls and his co-director, Seth Boakley, created an actual movie, which they filmed over 4 days on locations around Chicago. They built a fake taco stand in the theater, and they filmed all these sequences, which are projected as movies, full-fledged movies on a screen that comes down over the stage. So it's kind of a movie within a play, within a multimedia spectacle.
So this does not sound low budget, and in fact, it's funding. There's an interesting story behind where the money comes from.
Yes. Well, when I first heard about this production, when they announced it last year, I happened to learn that the funder, the money came from a foundation which I had never heard of. I did a little poking around, and I discovered that the man who started this foundation that gave them a big grant was Roy Cockrum, and it turned out he was a Powerball winner. He was a former monk. He was an actor who later became a monk, took vows of poverty at an Episcopal monastery in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He left the order to go care for his elderly parents in Tennessee. He bought a Powerball ticket. I think this was 2 years ago. He won a $250 million jackpot, and he took the lump sum, and one of the things he did with it was create this foundation to fund, wildly ambitious theatrical projects. And this was his first grant. So as one of the directors, as Seth Boakley, one of the directors of the play, said to me, it's like a perfect Bolaño story, a former actor turned monk who wins the Powerball. It's just kind of like the sort of wild thing that happens in this novel.
So I imagine there are some serious Bolaño fans waiting for this play to open.
Yes, definitely. And an interesting thing is Patti Smith is a huge Bolaño fan. I think she talks about him a lot in her recent memoir, Avenue M. After my story ran yesterday, I heard a great anecdote from an editor in Spain I know who was close with, has worked with the Bolaño estate. And she passed on this great anecdote about how when Patti Smith was on tour in Spain, she was in Blanes, the town in the Costa Brava where Bolaño lived until his death in 2004. And apparently, Patti Smith made her entire band read 2666, which seems like a tall order, 900 pages. It took me 3 days of doing nothing else to read the novel. The fourth part of the book is very intense. It's where you really kind of get into these murders, and there's just recitation of kind of body after body that's discovered in the desert, sort of reported in this very kind of blunt, almost journalistic forensic report kind of way. And the cumulative effect is really powerful and almost unbearable. And reportedly, a member of her band told her he just couldn't take it anymore and wanted to stop. But she insisted that, we have to face the truth, which I think is also certainly part of what Bolaño was doing, and also what this play is trying to do, make us kind of look at this violence that pervades the world and that we can easily ignore.
I feel like this is something all band leaders should do.
I agree.
All right. Thanks, Jenny.
Thanks, Pamela.
Molly Young, our help desk columnist, is here now. Hi, Molly.
Hi, Pamela.
We're going to talk about 4 books about distraction and what it does to our productivity. And the 4 books are The Productivity Project by Chris Bailey. And the subtitle for that is Accomplishing More by Managing Your Time, Attention, and Energy. Mindful Tech, How to Bring Balance to Our Digital Lives by David M. Levy. Deep Work, Rules for Focused Success in a Distracted World by Cal Newport, and Pogue's Basics, Life, Essential Tips and Shortcuts That No One Bothers to Tell You by David Pogue. Why did you decide to look at productivity/distraction books this month?
Because like so many people, I feel beholden to my iPhone in a way that makes me physically and morally uncomfortable. And so much of self-help as a genre is about finding a new framework through which to view a sort of old problem. And I think the problem of intellectual discipline is one that has plagued people for many millennia or centuries. Approaching this problem by looking at it in opposition to our devices and our internet habits feels uniquely 2016 appropriate.
In our studio, Molly just witnessed me take my iPhone off the table and put it on the floor so that I could be with the program here. It always strikes me, though, when I think about reading one of these kinds of books. Like, I don't have time to read a book about making more time. Did you have that same fear going into reading these books?
Yes, and I think some of the authors, actually, one of the authors in particular, maybe falls a little bit victim to that mindset. I think when you talk about productivity...
Which author is that?
Chris Bailey, The Productivity Project. When you talk about productivity, it's a little bit like talking about efficiency, where it really isn't a sort of virtue in itself. It sort of matters very much what you apply it to, or what sort of project you're tackling. I mean, you could be a very productive procrastinator or a very productive consumer of internet porn, and those things aren't necessarily good things. But in one case, in the Productivity Project, I think the author maybe becomes obsessed with the idea of productivity for productivity's sake.
You write that in the Productivity Project that the author, Chris Bailey, says, while some people have normal interests like sports, music, and cooking, as strange as it might sound, I've always been obsessed with becoming as productive as possible. I have to say, I don't find that strange at all. I grew up reading Cheaper by the Dozen with the efficiency expert. I don't know if he quotes that book. If he does, he gains points. But what does he mean by being productive in this book? And what is he trying to get people to do?
What he means by being productive is accomplishing a task. And that task can be defined in basically any way. It could be something as small as trying out a yoga class, which is something he does, and then he finds himself in the yoga class spending most of the time thinking about all the stuff that he's accomplished outside of the yoga class. But in his case, it could be any task from, gaining 15 pounds of lean muscle mass to reading a certain amount of books or watching a certain amount of TED Talks. Checking anything off of a list.
It doesn't matter what it is, as long as you do lots of it in very little time.
Exactly.
It's funny because the sort of predecessor to many of these books seems to be, in certain ways, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which for whatever reason, a lot of people have been quoting to me recently, and in particular, quoting the rule that has something to do with, and I'm going to paraphrase here, having not read the book myself, that in the time that you are contemplating doing something, you may as well sort of just get it done. So like if you see something that needs to be accomplished, just do it right away before you can procrastinate. And I wonder how much has changed since he came up with that rule. And is that the kind of rule that people talk about here? Or are they talking more about setting aside time to do things later and just being more organized about how you do that?
These books sort of present themselves more in opposition to distraction. So it's more about renouncing the things that cause mental noise. So renouncing casual internet browsing, renouncing doinking on your iPhone, turning off your notifications. These 4 books are really about erasing the minor flashing lights and alerts that compromise our attention, prevent us from accomplishing sort of longer, more sustained periods of creativity or of thought.
It's interesting because it's that kind of goes in direct conflict then to that earlier rule, which is like if something needs attention right now, tend to it right now. And these authors are saying all that stuff that's trying to get your attention right now, ignore it, put it away, and deal with it at the appropriate time.
Exactly. And Cal Newport, who writes Deep Work, is a big proponent of sort of batching all of your small tasks into discrete periods of the day. So, for example, he defines shallow work as any task that you can accomplish sort of at any time with varying levels of attention and focus. So like checking email or washing dishes or responding to a text message, things like that. And he recommends taking all of those smaller activities and batching them into, say, a 1-hour period at the end of the day instead of sprinkling them throughout your workday, because they sort of distract from your ability to sustain attention on writing an opera or penning a novel or coming up with a new computer programming language, for example.
So in a way, this stands in opposition to the Productivity Project because it's very easy to be quote unquote productive. You could, as you say, answer 1,000 emails and then feel like you've gotten something done. But it sounds like what these other books are trying to do, at least Mindful Tech and Deep Work, is to say, don't do all of that little stuff because that's getting in the way of these larger, more sustained kinds of project and deeper thought.
Those 2 books make the distinction between productivity and busyness.
One of the things I thought was interesting is that two of the authors, David Levy and Cal Newport, come from the world of tech, or at least the world of academic tech, and that they are both professors of, Newport is a professor of computer science at Georgetown, and Levy is a professor in the information school at the University of Washington. And it strikes me a little bit as like trying to slay the beast that they have, given birth to. Do they address that at all in the books?
They do. And in a way, they're sort of patient zeros because they were vulnerable to these distractive elements probably long before most of us were. In the case of David Levy, he recalls being in his early 20s, studying at Stanford, and sort of already at that period of time, which was a couple decades ago, feeling sort of undiagnosable noise that he didn't like. He was distracted, and a friend of his took him to a Bay Area Zen meditation center, and where he crossed his legs and tried to focus on his breathing. And he writes in the book that he hated it and found it boring, but it planted a seed in him that there might be an alternative to the tech metabolism that he had found himself engaged in.
Levy's book is called Mindful Tech. What does that actually mean?
That means approaching your email inbox with a serene and attentive mindset where you are attuned to how each email makes you feel and how you feel as you're typing out responses, and just being aware of your emotional response as you click away instead of being distracted.
What does that actually do? What does that actually accomplish? Or am I too productivity focused in that question?
Ideally, that allows you to sort of make changes to your habits. A lot of people I know, including myself, sit down to our inboxes and kind of tune out, and then 20 minutes later, we've responded to a certain number of emails, but we feel vaguely queasy or uneasy, or maybe like we just blacked out for 20 minutes and aren't quite sure what we did with our time. And I think being aware of your habits, in David Levy's case, is a sort of first step to changing them.
Newport has a very different suggested response to email. What does he say people should do when confronted with their inbox?
Well, Newport points out something interesting, which is that email is still a new enough convention. There aren't really social rules that surround it, or at least not social rules that are rigid. So he points to some of his old professors at MIT and says, here are a bunch of guys who are busy with research. They've got a lot of important things to do. And if you email them, they probably won't respond to you. They take an approach where the sort of burden is on the person emailing them to make it worth their time to respond. And if they read an email and don't deem it worthy of a response, they won't respond. And this trains their correspondents to put more time and effort into approaching them, which is a win-win situation.
It's interesting because so many people nowadays, and books, blame technology for being the sort of source of distraction. But it seems to me that one of the other sources is people that you have to meet with, people whose cubicles surround your cubicle, and you can sort of hear them yammering away and get distracted by what they're looking at on their screen. I wonder if Cal Newport addresses that about, sort of the cubicalization of the modern workplace and the over-reliance on meetings, and if that is part of the forces distracting us from getting things done.
He does. And he actually has a sort of a playful approach. He's not averse to suggesting that people do things that are maybe a little bit antisocial in service of a higher purpose. So he is a big proponent of just carving out time, being pretty relentless, creating periods of time where people aren't supposed to get in touch with you, or periods of time where you isolate yourself, regardless of the social consequences. And as someone who works in an open plan office, I've actually experimented with a bunch of his techniques before I read the book, but then they were sort of ratified by his research.
Is it like noise reduction headphones and that kind of thing?
Did headphones. A few years ago, I bought a fez hat, a red wool fez hat, and I wore it.
It's a better look.
It's a great look, and I wore it around the office. It was called the distraction fez. And when I was wearing the fez, no one was allowed to approach me and interrupt my work. So the idea was that it was this tall red wool hat, and it looked silly, so that sort of offset or took the edge off what could be viewed as aggressive antisocial behavior. It was also visible from a distance, so that if somebody wanted to approach me from across the office, they would see me 50 yards away and know that I was not to be distracted, and they would know to email me or come back later. And the fez worked for a few months, and then I ended up retiring it because the wool irritated my scalp.
I was going to say, why are we speaking in the past tense about something so clearly effective? The other book that you write about is a little bit of a kind of departure from these other books. It's Pogue's Basics, Life Essential Tips and Shortcuts That No One Bothers to Tell You. It seems like a rather broad category, tips on life. How does he organize this?
These are life hacks. So this is a sort of programming approach to life improvement where, in computer programming, the most elegant solution is the one that involves the fewest lines of code. It's the quickest. This book is about cutting out unnecessary steps in your daily life. It's a compilation of tips that tell you exactly how to do something with the least amount of steps. So, for example, there's a key to the secret keyboard shortcuts of Netflix. Press the letter F to make the video fill your entire screen and press escape to shrink the video down again. That eliminates a nanosecond from your life, but it's probably worth knowing. You
use the term life hacks, and it's one of those expressions that I just wonder, is it just a hashtag or is there some real meaning to that phrase? Like, what does that actually mean, a life hack?
It's hard to discuss life hacks without referring back to the sort of computer terminology from whence it comes. I think of a life hack as a cheat code or a walkthrough. It's almost a shortcut in the video game of life that allows you to get something done with fewer steps than you might have had to if you hadn't known it.
You say that you can divide the tips in Pogue's Basics, life, into kind of three categories. There are, I think you said, the three things that you already knew. What else?
There's a group of things that you already know, and you open his book and you flip through them and you think, duh, I've been doing that my whole life. For example, if you want to drink a can of soda with a straw, you stick the straw through the pull tab to keep it from popping up out of the drink and hitting you in the nose.
You knew that?
I knew that. Of course I knew that. But then a third of the tricks are things that I had no idea about. And then a third of them are tricks that seem just on the edge of implausibility, but as though they might improve my life. So the book basically breaks down into, it's like 33% of each of those categories. But the interesting thing is, if you give the book to a friend and you have them flip through it, they will basically break them down, in my experience, into the same three categories. But the things within those categories will be completely different for each person. So the thing that was obvious to me will be completely new to them, and vice versa.
If you followed through on all of David Pogue's life hacks, would this make you a more focused person, a more productive person, both?
It has solved a lot of problems for me. For example, I have never in my entire life been able to remember in what order to set utensils. And I've had to Google it on my phone if I'm tasked with that at a dinner party, for example. And David Pogue solves the problem. The order of silverware is incredibly easy to remember. From left to right, it's alphabetical. Fork, knife, spoon, F, K, S. I'll never have to Google it again.
What else?
Attach a brightly colored ribbon to your luggage when you check it in at the airport so that when it pops out of the thing, you immediately see the neon colored ribbon that designates your bag and it allows you to recognize it more clearly.
Well, no, everyone's going to do that and then we'll all be screwed. When you look at these 4 books, what was the most helpful thing that came out of them for you?
Cal Newport has some really great tips about how to decrease the amount of emails that you have to send. For example, when you're planning a coffee date with someone, he has a template for an email that you can send that ensures that you won't have to go back and forth about time and date and location. He sort of creates this beautifully compact, dense, pate-like email that contains all of the information and all of the options. His book contains a lot of sort of practical prescriptions that you can immediately put into use to cut down on the time you spend doing things that you don't want to do.
All right, I'm going to ask an incredibly life-hacky or life-hackish question, which is for our distracted reader trying to be productive without overdoing it and wanting to hack through their lives as fast as possible. If you had to put these books in order of most helpful in terms of doing all that, it sounds like you're saying Deep Work by Cal Newport is kind of the most helpful?
Absolutely. And if you want to really hack it, you hire an intern to read the entire book for you and distill his messaging into 6 salient points.
And an unpaid intern.
Exactly. And then you read those points and you're done.
Okay. And then after that, if you had to go down the list.
Mindful tech is a really good option for people who are resigned to the fact that email and phones are part of our lives and they just want to be able to engage with those things more serenely.
So this takes you from mindless tech to mindful tech. Okay. And after that?
After that, Pogue's Basics. Pogue's Basics is a great book to give to the young whippersnapper in your life who can't remember how to set the table or can't park the car correctly or doesn't know how to butter toast or can't prevent their flip-flops from breaking or doesn't know how to chop an onion. It's just a really good compendium of advice about how to do things correctly.
All right. Thanks, Molly.
Thanks, Pamela.
Molly Young is our Help Desk columnist, and this week she reviews 4 books about distraction and productivity. The books are Deep Work by Cal Newport, Mindful Tech by David Levy, The Productivity Project by Chris Bailey, and Pogue's Basics, Life by David Pogue. Greg Cowles is here now with Bestseller News. Hi, Greg.
Hi, Pamela.
I think we have a lot new this week.
We do have some new books to talk about. There are 4 new titles on the hardcover fiction list. Starting down at number 13, the Scottish crime novelist Ian Rankin returns to the list. He brings his detective John Rebus out of retirement for kind of an ensemble novel called Even Dogs in the Wild. That's new at number 13. Then new at number 10, Karen Marie Moning continues her Fever series. She really got her start as a romance novelist and then turned to this kind of urban fantasy, still romance, but urban fantasy series, the Fever series set in Dublin. So she's back with the latest in the Fever series. It's called Fever Born, new at number 10. Then at number 8, Bernard Cornwell also continues his series, The Saxon Tales. This is the 9th book in that series called Warriors of the Storm. Bernard Cornwell, of course, does these historical novels set back in pre-England, pre-Britain England, back when it was Saxony. That's this Warriors of the Storm, new at number 8.
And a new number 1.
There is a new number 1. Danielle Steele returns to the list, and this is her second bestseller in the past couple of months. I think she was on the list back in December. This is a novel called Blue. Typical Danielle Steele, kind of a tragic story about a prominent anchor woman whose family is destroyed in an accident and who finds new meaning in life through helping a homeless boy.
And in nonfiction?
In nonfiction, there are just 3 new titles this week. Starting down at number 12, E.J. Dionne Jr., the journalist and columnist, has a book about Republican politics, kind of looking at how they've evolved since Goldwater's time, called Why the Right Went Wrong, recently reviewed on our cover.
Not topical at all.
Yeah, it ties right in, of course, to the presidential campaign. Then at number 5, another topical book, the reporter and New Yorker staff writer Jane Mayer has written a book called Dark Money that looks at the influence of the Koch brothers and several other wealthy families and wealthy individuals who have exerted a big influence in conservative politics in general over the last decade or so.
Also on our cover last week.
And in fact, Jane Mayer was on the podcast last week. And then another podcast guest this week, Bill Bryson, is new on the list at number 4 with his latest kind of comic travel book called The Road to Little Dribbling. Bryson, as our listeners know, is an American who lives in England. And so this is a look kind of from the American perspective at England, which revisits the topic of his earlier bestseller, Notes from a Small Island.
And what's at top of the list?
At the top of the list, Paul Kalanithi stays at number 1 with When Breath Becomes Air, his posthumously published account of his battle against cancer.
Here's one of our podcast mea culpas. We mispronounced his name last week on the podcast, and I think on the week before. So it is Kalanithi. Someone has introduced the mnemonic device Kalanick. I don't know if we really want to go there, but it is Kalanithi, not Kalanithi. So now we all know that.
Probably won't be the last name that we mispronounce.
And not the last name I'll correct you on. Okay, thanks, Greg.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. Our producer is Jocelyn Gonzalez, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.